Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hollywood Remembers video. Today, we're going to pay a heartfelt tribute to the American stars we've recently lost, as well as other beloved figures around the world who have touched our lives. Before we begin, if this content resonates with you, please leave a like. It helps the channel continue bringing you tributes made with respect and care. Thank you for being here. Now let's begin. Charles C. Stevenson, Jr. has passed away at the age of 95. For many people, his face is remembered from television, including his appearance on Will and Grace, a show that became part of American culture and everyday life for millions of viewers. He was one of those actors who might not always be front and center, but whose presence helped make a scene feel real, grounded, and alive. His death marks the quiet closing of a very long life, one that stretched across nearly a century of change. 95 years. That kind of time carries stories most of us will never fully know. The details of his passing have not been widely shared, and sometimes that feels appropriate. Not everything needs to be explained. What matters is the life that came before it. Charles belonged to a generation that learned the craft the slow way, showing up, learning lines, respecting the work, respecting the people around you. Roles came and went, but the job was always the same: serve the story, do your part, let the moment work. For viewers, performances like his blended seamlessly into the shows they loved, and that's a skill in itself, to feel natural, to not pull focus, to simply belong. Now he's gone, but the work remains, preserved in reruns, in memories, in quiet recognition. Charles C. Stevenson, Jr. lived a long life, did honest work, and left something behind. And for an actor, that's no small thing.
DJ Young Slade has died at the age of 27. Born in 1998, he was the son of Lil Jon, and for many, his name first came up through that connection. But he was carving out his own lane, behind the turntables, in studios, and around people who loved music the same way he did. In 2026, after several days of being reported missing, the news of his death was confirmed. Details around his passing have been kept limited, and sometimes that silence is all that should be said. What's clear is the shock it brought, especially to those close to him, and to a father who had already given so much of himself to the world through sound. 27 years is not enough time, not to finish growing, not to finish learning who you are. DJ Young Slade was part of a generation raised around music, shaped by it from an early age, surrounded by beats, energy, and long nights that felt endless. People who knew him talk about his passion, his curiosity, his desire to stand on his own, not just as a famous name's son, but as someone with his own voice and direction. His passing leaves behind grief that doesn't fit into words, for family, for friends, for anyone who saw promise still unfolding. DJ Young Slade is gone far too soon. What remains is love, unanswered questions, and a quiet reminder of how fragile life can be, even when the world is loud. David Anthony Roberts has died. He passed away in New York City on February 7, 2025. He was 85. Roberts was an American actor who moved between stage and screen with that rare kind of ease, the kind of performer who could walk into a scene, say a few lines, and still leave a clear impression. A lot of people remember him most for his work with Woody Allen. He appeared in 6 Allen films, and for many fans, his name is forever tied to Annie Hall, a movie that still gets talked about like it came out yesterday. He was born on October 22, 1939, in Manhattan, New York. And in a way, that feels fitting.
New York was the center of so much of his artistic world, the theaters, the film sets, the rhythm of the city itself. He also worked with major directors beyond Allen, including Sidney Lumet, Blake Edwards, and Herbert Ross. Different styles, different worlds, but Roberts had the kind of versatility that let him belong in all of them. What stands out, looking back, is the steadiness of his career. Not loud, not flashy, just real work done well over decades. The sort of actor other actors notice. Now he's gone, but the performances stay, in those films, in those scenes, in the memory of people who saw him do what he did best, make a story feel more human.
Catherine Ann O'Hara has passed away. She died on January 30th, 2026 in Los Angeles, California. She was 71 years old. Born on March 4, 1954 in Toronto, Canada, Catherine O'Hara built a career that stretched across more than 5 decades, and it's hard to think of another performer who could make people laugh, cry, and feel understood in quite the same way. She was a rare mix of sharp comedy and real emotional depth. On screen, she could be outrageous one moment, then quietly heartbreaking the next. That range earned her wide respect and a shelf full of awards, including a Genie, a Golden Globe, 2 Screen Actors Guild Awards, 2 Primetime Emmys, and 6 Canadian Screen Awards. But numbers never really captured what she meant to audiences. People knew her voice, her timing, the way she committed fully no matter how big or small the role. From film to television to voice work, she never felt repetitive. She felt alive, present, like someone you might actually know. Her work connected generations, parents, kids, grandparents, all finding something familiar in her characters. Humor that didn't talk down to you, emotion that didn't feel forced. Catherine O'Hara gave everything to her craft, and in return, she left behind decades of moments that still make people smile, laugh, and feel a little less alone. She's gone now, but her work keeps speaking, quietly, clearly, and for a very long time to come.
Dave Coulier is more than a familiar laugh from television. He is a story about performance and what happens when humor becomes both shelter and identity. This is not a timeline of jokes, sitcoms, or punchlines. It is a portrait of how a person learns to survive by making others feel comfortable, and how difficult it can be to step outside that role once the world expects it from you. From the outside, everything looks simple. A recognizable face, a safe presence, a career built on warmth rather than edge. The kind of entertainer families trust, the kind of voice that never feels threatening. But simplicity is often the final shape of something that began as tension. Dave Coulier grew up learning very early that tone mattered, not what you said, but how you said it. Not strength, but timing. In his household there was contrast, a figure of authority that expected control, structure, restraint, and on the other side, emotional warmth, reassurance, softness, permission to express. These opposing forces didn't cancel each other out. They created a narrow passageway. He learned to move between them, not by choosing sides, but by adjusting himself. Humor became the bridge. At first it wasn't ambition. It wasn't show business. It was defense. A way to diffuse tension without confrontation. A way to soften moments before they hardened. He discovered that voices could shift moods, that impressions could redirect attention, that laughter could pause discomfort, even if only for a second. And those seconds mattered. The skill didn't feel glamorous, it felt useful. As a teenager, Dave realized something quietly powerful. If people were laughing, they weren't looking too closely. At fear, at uncertainty, at the parts still forming. Comedy didn't just open doors, it closed questions. By the time the world began to notice him, he already understood performance not as spotlight, but as control of atmosphere. He could lower the temperature of a room. He could make adults less rigid. He could make peers feel at ease. That ability carried him forward quickly. Stand-up, voice work, auditions. Momentum followed because his presence felt safe, not electric, not dangerous. Safe. And in entertainment, safety travels far. Early success came without friction. Roles appeared that aligned perfectly with the image he already projected. The playful uncle, the harmless friend, the man who would never cross a line. He didn't need to explain himself. The audience understood him instantly. That's a gift. And it's a box. The rhythm of ascent was smooth. No rebellion, no rupture, just consistency. And consistency builds trust, especially with networks. Producers, families watching together on living room couches. But there is a quiet cost when identity and utility merge too early. Because when humor is how you protect yourself, you rarely stop using it. Even when protection is no longer necessary. Even when it starts to replace honesty. At this stage of the story, nothing has collapsed yet. No public reckoning, no regret. Only a pattern. The applause reinforces it. The opportunities reward it. The image hardens. And without noticing, the role becomes less something you perform and more something you are expected to be. This is the foundation. Not fame, not money, not television, but the emotional contract formed early. I will make you comfortable, and in return, I will belong. It works incredibly well, until the question shifts, because eventually the world stops asking what you do and starts assuming who you are. And that is where the real tension begins. Success did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like an invitation. By the time Dave Coulier found his place on television, nothing felt accidental. Every step seemed to confirm what the world had already decided about him. He wasn't cast to surprise, he was cast to reassure. And reassurance is powerful. In ensemble television, especially family-centered shows, not every character exists to evolve. Some exist to stabilize, to absorb tension, to reset emotional balance. Dave's presence did exactly that. He became familiar quickly, not because he demanded attention, but because he never competed for it. This kind of success is subtle. It doesn't overwhelm you. It wraps around you. Schedules became predictable. Audiences grew loyal. The laughter was consistent, dependable. His persona fit perfectly into a cultural moment that valued safety, warmth, and accessibility over edge. And that alignment matters more than talent alone. Television doesn't reward risk equally. It rewards reliability. The role reinforced something he had learned long before fame. Staying likable keeps doors open. Staying agreeable keeps you employed. Staying in rhythm keeps conflict away. From the outside, it looked like stability. From the inside, it felt like confirmation. Not of who he might become, but of who he was expected to remain. There is a quiet psychological trade that happens here. When your public identity feels accurate enough, you stop questioning it. You stop asking what parts of yourself are being edited out. Because nothing hurts, nothing breaks. The laughter arrives on cue, the scripts resolve neatly. The audience smiles. Why disrupt something that works? But comfort has gravity. The more the image solidifies, the harder it becomes to test its edges. Opportunities begin to arrive pre-shaped. You aren't being asked who you are, only whether you can deliver the familiar version again. And Dave did. Not because he lacked range, but because the system rewarded consistency more than curiosity. At this stage, there is no visible conflict, no scandal, no collapse, just repetition. Successful, validated repetition, the kind most people would never want to escape. Yet psychologically, something subtle shifts. When humor becomes expectation rather than choice, it changes how silence feels. Silence starts to resemble absence. Stillness feels unproductive. Vulnerability feels unnecessary, even indulgent. Because the role already works. The audience doesn't ask for more depth. They ask for the same feeling again, and so you give it to them. But identity formed in response to expectation is fragile. Not because it's false, but because it's incomplete. Certain emotions simply don't fit into it. Doubt, fatigue, the need not to perform. Those don't disappear. They just lose their language. Inside, adulthood introduces new questions. about meaning, about growth, about being known beyond function. Outside, the world keeps rewarding the same shape. This is where the story becomes quiet, not a fall, not yet, just a narrowing. The success that once felt like belonging begins to feel like containment. But it's a comfortable containment, padded by laughter, paychecks, and nostalgia. And nostalgia is powerful. It freezes perception in time. Audiences remember how someone made them feel, not how they changed. Dave became part of that memory architecture, a fixed emotional reference point, the person who would always be the same when everything else shifted. That trust is rare and it's heavy, because when you are cast as emotional constant, growth begins to feel like betrayal of the audience, of the image, of the past. So you wait. You tell yourself there will be time later, another role, another moment, another phase. For now, you deliver what's asked, and that works, until it doesn't. Not because the world rejects you, but because something internal begins to ask different questions, questions laughter can't answer. This chapter ends not with a turning point, but with a pause. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you only recognize in hindsight. Because comfort, when prolonged too long, begins to feel suspicious. And the next chapter is where stability meets pressure, quietly, privately, without headlines. At some point, success stops asking questions, it assumes answers. For years, Dave lived inside a version of himself that worked flawlessly in public. The cadence was familiar, the reactions predictable. The role, both on screen and off, came with expectations that rarely needed explanation. Be funny, be light, be easy to be around. These instructions were never spoken aloud. They didn't need to be. They were embedded in every interaction, every interview, every casual recognition from strangers who felt they already knew him. This is where pressure changes shape. It no longer feels like fear of failure. It feels like fear of deviation. When your value is tied to emotional reliability, you become careful with anything that might disrupt it. You measure responses, you soften edges, you learn how to redirect moments before they deepen. Humor. Once a defense becomes maintenance, and maintenance is exhausting in ways applause doesn't reveal. Privately, the questions begin to stack quietly. Who am I when I'm not performing comfort? What happens if I don't smooth the moment? Is there space for gravity in a life built on lightness? These questions don't arrive as crises. They arrive as background noise, easily ignored, easily postponed, especially when life keeps functioning. There are still projects, still recognition, still the residual warmth of nostalgia. People still approach with smiles and familiarity, and that familiarity feels like affection, even if it's one-directional. Being liked at scale creates a strange loneliness, not isolation, invisibility, because people don't ask how you are. They assume. They reference a version of you that exists in memory, not in the present. You become a symbol of something simpler, and symbols are not expected to evolve. Inside that space, emotional honesty becomes inconvenient, not forbidden, just unnecessary in the eyes of others. So it retreats inward. Dave did what many do in this position. He stayed gracious. He stayed agreeable. He stayed available to the image that had supported him so well. There is no rebellion here, no dramatic rejection of the past, just a growing awareness that the external rhythm no longer matches the internal one. Time does that. As youth fades, the cost of performance increases, the body changes, energy shifts, the future stops feeling infinite. Reflection becomes unavoidable, and reflection doesn't always come with answers. For someone whose identity was shaped by reducing tension, confronting it directly feels unnatural, even selfish. Why disrupt what others enjoy? Why introduce complexity where none is requested? So instead, you compartmentalize. You laugh when expected. You deflect when asked. You keep the surface intact, but the internal ledger keeps track. There is a subtle grief that comes with being known for one dimension while others go unseen. Not anger, grief. The sense that parts of you matured quietly without acknowledgement. And unlike public downfall, this kind of conflict attracts no attention. It doesn't trend. It doesn't generate commentary. It simply accumulates. At this stage, there is still no singular moment to point to. No mistake. No collapse. Just the realization that external validation cannot resolve internal incongruence. That realization is unsettling because it reframes success not as a rival, but as negotiation. You begin to see how much of yourself was shaped in response to others' comfort. How rarely you asked whether you were comfortable too. How often laughter filled the space where something truer wanted to surface. This is the emotional crossroads. Not public, not dramatic, but decisive. You can double down on the role, preserving the version of yourself the world loves. Or you can begin, quietly, to renegotiate who you are allowed to be. Even if fewer people are watching. Neither choice is heroic, neither is wrong. But only one allows growth. And growth, when it finally begins, rarely announces itself with confidence. It starts with uncertainty, with pauses, with moments of saying less instead of more. The laughter doesn't disappear. It just stops being the whole story. This chapter ends with restraint, not resolution, because the next movement isn't about exposure or scandal. It's about silence, reflection, and redefining what legacy means when performance is no longer the goal. There is a moment in adulthood when performance loses urgency, not because it fails, but because something else begins to matter more. For Dave Coulier, that moment didn't arrive with headlines or applause. It arrived quietly through distance, through fewer appearances, through the slow recalibration that happens when external demand fades and internal awareness sharpens. Silence is often misunderstood as absence. But sometimes it is alignment. Stepping back does not always mean retreat. Sometimes it means refusing to keep moving in directions that no longer fit. When the world stops pulling as loudly, you begin to hear yourself again. And what emerges isn't regret. It's perspective. The laughter that once defined him doesn't disappear. It finds its proper scale. No longer armor, no longer obligation. Just one expression among many. A tool, not a contract. This shift reframes everything that came before. The early talent wasn't about being funny. It was about reading rooms. The success wasn't about fame. It was about belonging. And the conflict wasn't about loss of relevance. It was about identity narrowing too soon. Seen through maturity, the story stops being about career arcs and starts being about self-permission. At this stage, legacy becomes a different question. Not what did you produce, but who did you allow yourself to become? Fatherhood reframes priorities. Age reframes urgency. Time reframes ambition. The constant need to be recognized gives way to the quieter desire to be at peace with one's choices. There is dignity in that transition. The culture rarely celebrates it. It prefers comebacks, scandals, and reinventions with sharp edges. But emotional adulthood often looks unremarkable from the outside. Fewer interviews, less noise, more selectivity. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because not everything needs to be performed. Dave's story settles into this space, not as a cautionary tale, not as triumph, but as something more honest, a recognition that wholeness requires integration, humor with gravity, warmth with boundaries, visibility with privacy. The earlier chapters of his life taught him how to be for others. The later ones invite him to be with himself, and that may be the rarest role of all, because the greatest performance is not the one that earns the loudest response. It's the one you no longer need applause to sustain. The journey was never just about laughter. It was about learning when laughter was enough and when it wasn't. That is not a conclusion. It's a continuation, a reminder that identity is not fixed at the moment of public recognition. It evolves long after the cameras move on. And for those watching from the outside, the lesson is quiet but resonant. The most meaningful transformation doesn't announce itself. It happens when no one is asking you to perform, when the role dissolves, and you finally meet the person underneath, not as an image, but as a whole human being.